Good morning. How are y'all doing? Last day? I know you've been here. I know this has been long. I was like, wow, y'all are troopers. You put in that work. But I feel like I was telling someone I'm here to be your cheerleader because I'm coming in and I'm like, this is going to be amazing, y'all. I'm so excited for today. I'm excited for the conversations that are going to be happening today. I'm excited for the frames that folks are bringing and the questions that people are going to be asking today around the idea of archives, which is really talking about, knowledge and how we are engaging and holding that knowledge and using that knowledge. So, as an educator, as a writer, I love archives. I love archivists. Y'all are the best people. You're like, you have one question and it's like, well, let's explore everything about that. This is going to be amazing. Yes. So I'm very excited that this space has been created. I'm excited to the organizers for envisioning and holding this space as well. And so I think, liberated and archive are great words, two amazing words that I love. And I think that it's important to think about what each of those words mean individually as well as collectively. And I'm sure that y'all will have really amazing conversations about that in different workshops that you're doing. But I think that it's important, and this, but when we talk about archives, so often folks, who are not archivists or librarians or folks who engage with archives, or maybe even folks who do engage with archives, think about it as, something that is completely separate from real life, right? It's this kind of storehouse, this cold, musty vault somewhere buried deep in a university, where there will be librarians or other folks in charge shushing you if you sneeze or move your chair too loudly, is often how folks think about that. And I think it's important to recognize that idea didn't come out of nowhere, right? That is actually a construction of power. It's a construction about who holds history, who holds knowledge, who controls it, and who has access to it. And so I think it's important to recognize that the ways that archives have functioned have been as ways to reinforce existing power structures. And so thinking about liberated archives, first you have to understand the role that archives are playing, the role that knowledge has played in continuing to uphold oppressive and unequal systems historically. Before we can think about what does it mean to liberating it, we actually have to understand how it's working. And so I think that it's important to acknowledge that and to acknowledge that knowledge has often been chained and bound and colonized. And so, I know that there are workshops that talk about the decolonization process of archives. I think it's important to talk about the decolonization process of knowledge in general as part of that. So I think it's important to note that, archives in and of themselves and knowledge in and of themselves are not liberatory. It's how we use it. It's the process through which they're conceived and dreamed of. It is how they are created, who is engaging with them, who is holding them, and the ultimate purpose that they serve and are used for. That is where the sort of liberatory framework comes into play. And I think that there are principles and values to be talked about that have to be internalized when you talk about that. So it's not just enough to say, yes, everyone's open, everyone's welcome. You don't have to file a form in triplicate 6 months in advance and be sponsored by 37 people and have a criminal background check to come in here and access these archives behind glass, right? I mean, that's a great start to say no to any of that. But it's not enough to just say, sure, come on in, right? That's not what liberated archives look like. And so, I think that it's important also to recognize, all successful social justice movements have a diversity of tactics. I think that a lot of times folks spend time saying, well, this is the right way to do things. What is the one right way? And if you're saying something that's different than me, we must be in conflict. We must argue or disagree or tweet at each other until one of us demolishes the other one and declares victory, right? And again, all successful movements for social change have a diversity of tactics. So they say yes and rather than no but. And so I think that that's important in all the aspects of thinking about what does freedom, what does liberation look like in the everyday. So this is not about saying no to institutional archives, no to university archives. It's saying yes and, right? So how do we engage with the archives that already exist in these institutions that were created to maintain power structures, right? University systems, the system of education was created to maintain white supremacist patriarchal capitalism. Like, that's just, boom, there it is, good morning, right? But that doesn't mean that there aren't spaces and ways to reclaim that, there aren't spaces and ways to use that, and there aren't spaces and ways to subvert that. And I love the word subversion when dealing with existing institutions, and I think that because it makes me kind of feel like a spy, first of all, like dun, dun, dun. But it also acknowledges these institutions were not created for us. We are not pretending they were created for us. We're not going to pretend that we can, just switch them over in some, with some superficial changes. But instead, we can find ways to burrow in and to get what we need out of these institutions, even though those institutions may be fighting us all the way. But I think it's also important, the yes and, to say, how do we dream community-based archives as well? How do we deal with what already exists, but how do we also say, what do we want? What would be the vision for what a truly liberated archive created by the people who are directly impacted, held by the people that are directly impacted, and used for the liberation and freedom of people who are directly impacted, and therefore for all of us, what would that look like? And so I'm hopeful and I'm sure that you'll be having a lot of those conversations today in your different workshops. So, I'm excited for y'all to have those spaces. And I think it's important, when you disperse after your time here, to create spaces as well, to say, what is the world that we want? What is, the sort of knowledge base that we want? What is the archive that we want? And have those conversations. I do a lot of work around science fiction and organizing, which I'll talk more about later, because sometimes people are like, what are you, science fiction and organizing? Did I mishear that? It's 9 a.m. Has the coffee not kicked in? You did not mishear it. But, so often, I think in social justice movements, we've been told to be realistic, right? Just what is a reasonable win? What little reform can we eke out of this system? And instead, I think it's important to recognize that all real, true, substantive social change was considered to be an impossibility before it happened. People were told it was science fiction, it was a fantasy, it would never happen. 8-hour workday, never going to happen. Women getting the right to vote, never going to happen. The end of legal slavery in this country, never going to happen, right? And folks said, well, we're not going to just take your piecemeal reforms that you're offering. We are going to dream that science fiction and make it reality, and they did. But first you have to have that space to say, what do we want? Beyond the boundaries of what we're told is possible or what is real. And so I hope that you create those sort of visionary spaces to have those conversations with each other in your institutions and in your communities, so that you can be developing that vision that you're moving towards. And it may not be something, it may exist beyond, 2-year grant cycles or the funding cycle for universities. It may be a vision that's 20, 50, 100 years. But having those kind of visions give us something to move towards together, to dream together, and to dream into being together. So I've used archives and seen archives engaged in a lot of different ways and have had amazing opportunities to see folks using archives in really liberated ways. And so I'm going to just share some of those examples to talk a little bit about those principles and values that I think are important around liberated archives. And I'm going to focus on 3 areas of my work. One is focusing around Oregon Black history. Welcome to Oregon if you're not from here. It's about to get real. Another area is the history of movements of resistance, movements for social justice, especially around challenging the prison industrial complex. And the last piece is around science fiction and organizing. So I'll just talk a little bit about some of the experiences I've had around those. So around Oregon Black history, how many folks here are not from Oregon? Boom, all right. Felt like we were doing the wave there for a minute. Great. So, encapsulated, so I'm trying to do the abbreviated version and not the 2-hour version where I'm like, and then, y'all, in 1965. So, you know, Portland especially sort of exports this idea of Portlandia, right? This amazing liberal playground where it's the 90s and you can, you know, you can just have unicorns and birds on things and that ideology is, you know, and so this idea that Portland is the most progressive city in America, and Portland certainly likes to say that about itself as well, right? And then folks will say, well, and, I mean, there aren't a lot of people of color here. It's pretty white. But it's really progressive. I don't think those two things can coexist in the same space and time, right? That if you are progressive, then at the core is justice. And if people of color cannot live here because of economics, because of laws, because of practices, because of feeling completely unwelcome, then you are not progressive, right? And so the idea of Oregon itself and the Northwest actually as a whole, it was founded as a racist white utopia, right? So the entire Northwest, which was called the Oregon Territory, that was not just Oregon, Washington, Idaho, parts of Wyoming and Montana were the Oregon Territory. And so basically the call went out to white folks, come here and build the sort of white utopia, the white society you have dreamed of, away from the problems of the day, which meant the presence of people of color, right? We know we're good at reading code words. And white folks flocked and answered that call, right? And because of this, many laws and practices were put into place, one of which was that Oregon was the only state in the Union admitted with a racial exclusionary clause in its constitution. It was a black exclusion clause. So in Oregon's constitution, it said that black folks were not allowed to live here, to hold property, or to make contracts, right? So black people the very existence of being black in Oregon was criminalized. This was first passed before Oregon even became a state in 1844, where blackness was banned. It also included the lash law that said that black folks would be publicly whipped up to 39 lashes every 6 months until they left Oregon. I think the other piece that's really important about this is that this was in Oregon's constitution until 2001. So the language, even though the law was repealed earlier, the language was in the Constitution until 2001. Even though the black community came to Oregon through the legislature, through ballot boxes again and again and again, saying, please remove this from your Constitution. Please tell us this is not the kind of place you want to live. And over again, Oregon reinforced, actually, this is exactly the kind of place that we want to live, right? And it was a fight to get it removed in the 21st century. It did not pass easily, right? So I think that this is incredibly important, and this is not information that is accessible in public spheres in Oregon, in Portland. It is not part of the mandated curriculum for public schools in Oregon. So this is information, and I've traveled around for years presenting about this information, and I ask how many people have gone to public school in Oregon, how many people learned any of this, and I can count on 2 hands how many people say that they had learned anything about this in public school in Oregon. So this is why this information and this idea of knowledge and who controls it is so important. And understanding this history is the only way that we can understand Oregon today and Portland today, right? So, that was just a little quick Portland 101 WTF. But so I think that the piece that's really important, and that that I think is a very important principle and value when we're talking about liberated archives, is to make sure that we're always seeing oppressed people as active change makers and not as passive victims. All of the advances in racial justice that have happened in this world have happened because of the courage, determination, and vision of people of color, of the people who are most directly affected. So people of color are active change makers and leaders. They don't need saviors, they need allies, right? And so I think that that history is not something that is captured properly. And so you get things being put out, even documentaries around, some of this Black history that says the changes that happened, like the repeal of the language, or like the taking out the language from the Oregon Constitution, was led by white legislators. And they were like, "Woo, we did it for you Black people, you're welcome," right? And it completely erases the fact that, again, Black folks for decades had been organizing under the most adverse and dangerous conditions for racial justice, including removing this from the language, or the language from the Constitution. And so, liberated archives have to center not only the voices and the experience, but the leadership and vision of those people who are directly affected. It's not enough to just say, let's document the oppression that's happened, let's be honest about it. Let's view it through this empowerment lens so we can see the self-determination of oppressed people, and in this case, of Black folks who made Oregon a better place for everyone, right? I am going to assume for my own mental health that everyone in this room feels that Oregon is a better place with that language out of the Constitution. Thank you. Sadly, I was like, these are assumptions you can make. And I feel like this past year has shown me that there are no assumptions that can be made. But again, that is the leadership of Black folks and people of color that have made that community better for all of us. And so taking that leadership and making sure that we're highlighting that leadership at every level of creating liberatory archives or projects that are engaging around that. So I want to just make sure I'm staying focused, because I have a tendency to go off on, and I wanted to be like, and another thing. Don't and another thing, Walidah, just stay focused. So I know that there's a workshop later with Chris Paschchild, who works at the Special Collections at PSU, and I have used those every class that I've taught, and I love taking students to the archives. It's that day and the day when I bring in speakers who are actually doing work in the community are the days that the students are like, life is awesome, this class is amazing. So I try to do them like in the middle, around that lag, when I was like, oh, I can't make it. And then the end, so when they fill out evaluations. Kidding, totally kidding. But one of the collections that Portland State University has is the Charlotte Rutherford collection. And Charlotte Rutherford was an amazing Black leader. Her family has been organizing in the Black community in Oregon and Portland for 100 years. And she worked, just as a community member and a leader to preserve history. And some of the documents, right? She worked with the founding the NAACP, and her family did, and doing a lot of the work that was happening around civil rights in Portland. But a lot of the papers are like saran wrapped and then pressed with an iron. That like bootleg. She's like, I'm doing this, right? And I think, and I'm sure some of the archivists are like, no, you're ruining the documents. But I think that idea, is about the vision of Charlotte Rutherford and the vision of these Black community leaders who said, at a time when the institutions that were archiving Oregon history wanted nothing to do with Oregon Black history, didn't think it was important, didn't want those papers, didn't want those archives, didn't even return calls. They said, this is important history. It's going to be necessary for the future. We are going to make sure that it's saved and preserved. And so, I think raising up that leadership, again, of folks who are marginalized, and especially of people who sit at the intersections of identities and oppressions. Charlotte Rutherford, as a Black Black woman was holding the space. And so the vision that we see is wider and broader because of that. And so it's incredibly important to make sure that, those folks who are sitting at the intersections are at the table in the leadership thinking about what do we save, what do we not save, right? So to talk a little bit just about the history of social movements, I think that there are just a couple of projects that I've used that I wanted to highlight, and that are based in community. So they're the idea again of subverting existing archives, but there are organizations like the Freedom Archives in San Francisco, which is an amazing resource that is archiving information about social movements, specifically from around the 60s to the 80s, and really trying to archive the movements around Black and brown liberation, around women's rights, around queer rights, around sovereignty, around anti-war, and they have a physical space as well as a digital space as well. And they're producing new documentaries based on that to try and put this information out. So they actually just finished a documentary around the Chicano power movement. And this is really important because there is a significant lack of information around that, especially around the government repression. And so because they are a community-based organization, they heard from folks, this is what is needed. This is where there's a lack. As we're sharing this information, people are like, we never heard this before. Tell me more. And so they were able to respond to that and put it together in a way that is accessible to folks. And I think that's the other piece, is about making sure it's accessible to people. And again, it's not just about saying, come into the archives, right? Even if it's open and it's free and you can just walk in, you don't even need ID. Just come in, just put the gloves on. But it's cool, you don't need ID. That's not enough, because these institutions for centuries have been telling oppressed peoples, you do not belong here. And so you can't change that just by sending out an email and saying, hey, it's open, and then sitting there and saying, why aren't people of color coming, right? So it's important to say, how do we make sure that this information is accessible? How do we take this knowledge that people actually want, not what we assume they want, out into the community where folks can use it and engage with it? And the Oregon Black Pioneers, actually, to go back to Oregon a little bit, they have a great traveling mobile exhibit where there's hands-on archival material. They take it to schools, to elementary schools as well. And I think that piece is really important, too, in terms of accessibility, making sure that we are thinking about the widest audience possible, right? Of saying, this is not just about taking this to an academic conference. This is about saying, how do we make sure everyone can engage with this and wants to engage with this, right? Because it's one thing you're like, well, yeah, I understand. I don't really care, but I understand, right? But it's another thing for folks to say, this is compelling, this is interesting, I want to know more. So the Freedom Archives, I think, is a great model of folks who are doing that work outside of these historic kind of societal institutions, and instead rooting deeply in the community. And as I said, a lot of the work that I do is around the prison industrial complex and challenging it. And I think that there are amazing ways that folks are re-envisioning archives, as living, breathing human beings as well. And I think that that's important as well, to recognize we are individually and collectively archives. And so to say, how do we capture that knowledge and how do we put it forward in an accessible way? And so just one example is the Storytelling and Organizing Project, STOP is the acronym, Storytelling and Organizing Project. And they are collecting people's stories about how they dealt with harm or violence in their communities, in their families, outside of the criminal legal system. So they did not want to call the police, they didn't want to send folks to prison, but they wanted to address harm that was happening. They wanted to stop harm, or harm had come up, and they were like, what do we do about this? And they're just recordings and written transcripts of folks talking about this. I think that's, it's incredibly important, because also those folks are being shown as experts. So they're not just relaying, this is what happened. They're relaying, this is what happened. They're saying, this is what we were thinking about it. And then they're analyzing it and saying, here are the lessons we learned. Here are the questions we still have about that. Here are some things that we've learned since then and we implemented, and now, we've gotten different outcomes. So again, not only are folks active change makers, they are also experts and should be respected as such. And so I think that project is a really amazing one. It also really centers queer and trans people of color. And I can't say again that when we look at the intersections of oppression, and we see the ways that folks have been resisting and building outside of the system. There's an amazing project around alternatives to police by the Audre Lorde Project, which is queer and trans people of color, called Safe Outside the System, SOS. And I think that framework is so powerful, safe outside the system, that for oppressed and marginalized people at the intersections, they've known that there is no safety in this system. They know that calling the police actually often ends up with them being beaten or arrested or assaulted. And so folks have been for decades or for centuries creating systems outside of these oppressive structures to keep one another safe. And so looking at that is incredibly important because it's when we look at those intersections and the vision that folks have at those intersections that we see what true and total liberation can look like for all of us. And so that piece about that folks have been doing this for decades or 100 years or more, that's kind of where I want to bring us to, and that's where the science fiction comes into play. So I told you, wait for it, it's coming. But now I'll take a dramatic pause. So, as I said, I've done a lot of work around science fiction and organizing. I co-edited an anthology called Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction Stories from Social Justice Movements. It is, you guys. It is science fiction and fantastical stories written by organizers and activists. And so many of the people had never written fiction, let alone science fiction, but we knew that they were great writers, and we knew that they were holding these visionary spaces within the work that they were doing every single day. Because my co-editor, Adrienne Marie Brown, and I strongly believe that all organizing is science fiction, right? Anytime we imagine a world without war, a world without borders, without prisons, right, that is science fiction. That world does not exist. But we can't build what we can't imagine. Right? And so we need visionary spaces, fantastical spaces that, again, allow us to throw out everything we're told is real and start with the question, what is the world that we want? And then then all we have to do is make it, like that, no biggie. But I think that a lot of times when we talk about science fiction, folks are thinking only about the future, right? And that's really rooted in this, Western colonial white supremacist ideology of history as this linear progression towards greatness, right? That the past is savagery and we're constantly getting better, right? Which is a justification for colonialism, right? Y'all, before we came along, didn't know what you were doing, you little brown people, so you're welcome, right? And so we can feel good about exploiting you and massacring you and extracting your resources and devastating everything you love because we're moving history forward. And I think it's really important that, I won't go on a time travel rant. I swear to God, I will not go on a time travel rant. But I think it's really important to recognize that linear time is a method of social control, right? That we're told this is all we have. The past is gone. There's nothing it can do for you. The future is unknowable. You can't do anything about that. So all you have is the present. So just be as happy as you can, get as much as you can, watch as many movies, numb yourself, just get through it, because that's all you have. And instead, many societies, historically, brown cultures have recognized that time is not linear, right? It's circular, it's spherical, it exists in multiple places at once, that we live in the past, the present, and the future all together, right? And this is quantum physics now, right? Now. So it's, we're all like, welcome to the game, quantum physicists. We've been here, but thanks for now acknowledging and validating what we've known forever. So I think it's important, that's important. And I think that has a very strong impact on this idea of liberated archives, right? Because that we need that past to move forward into the future, right? That we need these visions of liberation that existed before. We need to be able to study them. We need to be able to explore them. We need to be able to say, what is the wisdom and knowledge that exists in the past that will help us build the future, right? And so these are a lot of principles of Afrofuturism or Black futurism. The ancient future, right? We are not saying that the past is savagery and the future is, perfection where we live in chrome and glass, floating sky cities. But instead saying, our ancestors existed in the past, the present, and the future at once. And so recognizing how they saw the world, how they envisioned the future or lived the future is something that can help us to create the future that we want. And so, that is so, I think archives are so key to that, because it's not just about, having the information, it's about having those tangible objects, those pieces that you can hold and touch, and in many ways time travel through, right? I mean, I was teaching at Stanford this last year for a year, and they have Black Panther leader Huey Newton's archives, and I was holding Huey Newton's diary. I'm like reading his diary where he's like drawing little stick figures next to his like amazing political exploration of, apartheid. And then he has some pressed flowers on the next page. Pressed flowers, y'all. It's just like, y'all know, but, the image of Huey Newton in the rattan chair with the gun and the spear, which is amazing. And then in his diary, he has these beautiful little pressed flowers. I'm like, this is why archives are important, because we're whole human beings. And if we only see these flat images, we can't build a future out of that. We can't build a future just out of a gun and a spear and a rattan chair, right? I'm not saying we don't need the gun and the spear and the rattan chair. But we need the pressed flowers too, right? And we need to be able to see ourselves as whole, and we need to be able to envision futures where we can be whole. And so those archives and those histories are so important for that. And so I just wanted to share a little piece of one of the stories from Octavia's Brood. It's by Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who is an amazing Black feminist, queer, visionary, and academic and storyteller, and she's doing her own kind of Black feminist storytelling archives project herself that you should definitely check out. And this piece is called Evidence, and it's really about time traveling through research, through archives as academic practice. And so in the story, it's someone in the future researching this time, right? They got free in the future, so she's like, by the way, everything's awesome. It all works out, you guys. No spoilers, but it all works out. So, she's researching this time, but she's actually sending messages back to this time. And, Alexis's question is, through sort of, archives, academic research, scholarship, can we actually reach back into the past and change it and impact it? Not just learn from the past, but actually reach back in the past and impact it to, ensure the future that we want. Not in some kind of, oh yes, in theory, but in real ways. So I just wanted to read the introduction to it. By reading past this point, you agree that you are accountable to the Council. You affirm our collective agreement that in the time of accountability, the time past law and order, the story is the storehouse of justice. You remember that justice is no longer punishment. You affirm that the time of crime was an era of refused understanding and stunted evolution. We believe now in the experience of brilliance on the scale of the intergalactic tribe. Today, the evidence we need is legacy. May the public record show and celebrate that Alandrix consciously exists in an ancestral context. May this living textual copy of her digital compilation and all its future amendments be a resource for Alandrix, her mentors, her loved ones and partners, her descendants and detractors to use in the ongoing process of supporting her just intentions. We are grateful that you are reading this. Thank you for remembering. With love and what our ancestors called faith, the Intergenerational Council of Possible Elders. So I was like, I want that future so bad, y'all. But I think, again, that vision of saying what are the principles and values, and we don't have to figure out what it exactly looks like, but instead saying, how do we want to be, I think is a great and important question. How do we want to be individually and collectively? And I think that if we solidify those principles, then we will always be moving in the right direction. And so I think that, we, all of us, are a collective archive, and we have countless and endless quantum possibilities for liberation, but it does take that idea of incorporating those values and principles of self-determination, of autonomy, of empowerment, of decolonization, and of liberated vision. And I think that, the past is one of our countless starting points. And so I'm thankful for y'all for holding that space, that ancient future. And I, again, just really hope that you continue these conversations, obviously today, but as you go forward, and to really talk about what is the world that we want to live in, and then how do we do the hard, because it is hard work, right? But it's also beautiful, glorious, and empowering work of making that our everyday lived realities. So thank you all so much. I hope you have an amazing day. Thank you.